In 31 BC, the Third Roman Civil War came to a swift end when Octavian's navy soundly and decisively thwarted the combined fleet of Mark Antony and Queen Cleopatra. The disastrous outcome forced Cleopatra to retreat to her home, Alexandria, which was the capital of Egypt at the time. She knew that Octavian and the full might of Rome would come after her before long, and though she knew her position was moribund, she used her guile to consider how to flee the expanding reach of Roman rule. Perhaps she could find her way to India. She toyed with sailing west through the Straits of Gibraltar and then heading south to circumnavigate the African continent. She also pondered sailing west, directly into the Atlantic. The ancient map of her day would have made this a possibility. There was a short period where Cleopatra seriously considered sailing the Atlantic to avoid Roman capture. However, Cleopatra would ultimately put aside her ambitious retreat and would die shortly thereafter. But the notion of sailing west was an idea rooted in the minds of many for centuries. Little did Cleopatra know that 1500 years after her death, a Genoese man with no relation to Rome would do exactly that. On August 3, 1492, Christopher Columbus and a crew of 40 men boarded the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Columbus himself manned the Nina. The entire expedition cost $14,000 in today's money. Columbus was equipped with a magnetic compass, a quadrant, and an astrolabe. It's important to note that when he left Spain, he didn't immediately hail west. Instead, he segued south to the Canary Islands, where he could sail amidst the northeast trade winds to help expedite and guide his voyage to the Orient. He arrived at the Canaries in mid-September to restock his fleet, and on September 6th, he launched himself once again into the open sea, where he would spend the next 35 days. Columbus's preferred method of navigation was dead reckoning, where he would estimate his location and distance traveled with the aid of a magnetic compass. He had employed this method of navigation for most of his life. He did attempt to use the astrolabe to measure his position by tracking the movements of the sun, moon, and stars every now and then, but his results were mostly inaccurate. The journey was not a pleasant one. A month had passed, and according to Columbus's calculations, Japan should have been found already. The crew was growing increasingly bored, and as his provisions began to empty, the crew became worried as well. If they ran out of supplies, they would all die before they could turn back and reach Spain. In early October, some men spotted floating vegetables and birds, but still no land. As the days slowly passed, the crew became deluded. False land sightings became so frequent that a frustrated Columbus ordered his men to stop under severe penalty. His accomplices considered mutiny. They even contemplated throwing Columbus overboard. And then, something that would have appeared miraculous to the men occurred. On October 12, 1492, a Spanish navigator aboard the Pinta reported a land sighting. This time, he was correct. However, in his memoirs, Columbus would claim that it was he who first discovered land. In any case, he and his crew docked their vessels, and they vigorously approached the small island that awaited them. They were so overwhelmed to finally be on solid ground, some of the men even kissed the sand on the beaches that they believed had saved them. The first part of the New World to be introduced to the Old World was a small island in the Bahamas called San Salvador. As the ecstatic Spaniards looked around, they noticed that they were being curiously surveyed by a group of naked natives. The natives introduced themselves as the Taino tribe. They were a peaceful and pacifist tribe that carried no weapons and were adorned with gold earrings. Columbus praised the appearance of the Taino and remarked on their intelligence and ability to recite Spanish words and phrases after only hearing them once. He was very taken with them, and when his crew and the Taino engaged in trade, he harshly forbade his men from handing over bits of broken crockery, in his own words. After a few days, Columbus was off exploring the new string of islands he had stumbled upon, which he named Santa Maria, Ferdinanda, and Isabella. Now, he was well aware that he had found something new. He still remained determined that Japan was just around the corner. But a month had passed since landing on San Salvador, and he was still deprived of discovering anything that reflected the Eastern Pacific. He had also failed to locate gold, which he promised the Spanish court in exchange for their monetary aid to finance more voyages. In early November, he rerouted his course south, convinced that it would take him to China. Instead, he hit Cuba and sailed along the Cuban coast. He turned east and eventually settled in La Navidad, in modern-day Haiti. His men had finally struck gold, and it was just enough to compensate for not being able to confirm that they had found the Orient. However, the Santa Maria was left unguarded and collided into a colony of rocks, whereupon Columbus ordered it to be burned. Out of the wreckage, he built a small fortress, and he ordered 39 men to remain behind, since there was no longer enough room for everyone on the Nina and Pinta to return home. On January 13th, they departed for Spain. taking with them a small group of natives. Unfortunately, very few of the natives survived the sojourn. A few weeks in the return journey, a terrible squall blew Columbus off course to Santa Maria, the Portuguese-owned islands in the Azores. He and his men were detained by the governor, who mistook them for pirates, but they were soon released, and 7 months after their journey had begun, they finally arrived back home, where they were graciously lauded by the king and queen. After his return, a letter detailing Columbus's findings was immediately sent to Rome, where it was then published and widely distributed all over Europe. The news was spellbinding. The European population was baffled. The world before them seemed to have doubled in size. Indeed, the world was forever changed. This was perhaps one of the greatest achievements ever in human history. Eager to capitalize on the gains made by Columbus's first journey, Ferdinand and Isabella administered the second voyage to the New World in just a few months' time. Columbus embarked from the Spanish port in the fall of 1493 with 17 ships and 1,200 men. This monumental expedition comprised of priests, farmers, mechanics, carpenters, and soldiers, all with the intention of constructing permanent colonies in the name of Christianity, as ordered by the Spanish crown. Columbus himself was anointed governor over the new colonies. The second voyage was much smoother, as it only took 3 weeks and there were no attempted mutinies. On November 3rd, the Spanish explorers landed just south of the Dominican Republic on an island Columbus named Dominica. This island was one part of a cluster of islands known as the Lesser Antilles, and they were all discovered and named by Columbus. They include Marie Galante and Guadalupe. En route to the settlement he left behind at La Navidad, Columbus came across the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. There are accounts that the Spanish battled with a sordid, cannibalistic tribe in St. Croix before arriving at Hispaniola on November 22nd. This immense fleet also brought with them cows, sheep, pigs, and horses. This was the first time in 9,000 years that a horse had stepped foot on American soil, the last which died out during a massive extinction event. Unfortunately, the presence of these domesticated animals would have profoundly adverse effects on the American natives over time. Columbus finally returned to La Navidad near the end of 1493, expecting a warm reunion with his men, but instead he found his settlement in ruins and some dismembered corpses. All 39 of his men were dead. The dark turn of events spiraled into a series of hardships that marked this second voyage. A Spanish council demanded the slaughter of the indigenous peoples involved, but Columbus prevented this from happening, knowing that relations between the Spanish and natives must exist on a precedent of civility. Several colonies were built along Hispaniola. The largest of these was named La Isabela. As governor, Columbus was in charge of overseeing the well-being of the New World's first colonies. But his heart was set on exploration, and he often left the colonies to fend for themselves while he circumnavigated Cuba and Jamaica, still certain that he would find the Eastern Pacific in due time. The colonies of Hispaniola fared poorly, and what Columbus possessed in navigation, he sorely lacked in governorship. The colonists, along with Columbus, began to grow very ill. They were running desperately low on provisions, and many were even beginning to starve. The natives were now subjects to the crown. They were not slaves, but they were coerced to partake in manual labor. To counter the anger and frustration fomenting under his rule, Columbus ordered harsh punitive measures against the dissent. Surprisingly, this only made matters worse, and before long, La Isabela was on the brink of rebellion. In the spring of 1496, after 2 years of increased misery and no gold for which to compensate, Columbus headed back to Spain. He left with assurances that he would return with ample supplies for the struggling colonies. But La Isabela was eventually abandoned for a new settlement in Santo Domingo. Columbus was commissioned with a third expedition to the New World in May of 1498. Making good on his promise to help the fledgling colonies, he left Spain with 6 ships filled to the brim with food and supplies. But his curiosity got the better of him, and Columbus parted with 3 of his ships out of a desire to explore lands farther south of the West Indies, certain that this time he would contact China. His trajectory led him to the Venezuelan coast and the Gulf of Paria. He was so amazed by the beauty of the South American milieu that he dubbed all of it Paria. He even referred to South America as the Garden of Eden. He spent the late summer of 1498 traversing west along the Venezuelan coast, and he came across the Orinoco River emptying into the Atlantic. The sheer size and scope of the river led him to correctly assert that what he was gazing upon was an unfounded continent. But the good fortunes of his third voyage rapidly de-escalated. Poor health forced Columbus to return to Hispaniola in late August of 1498. When he arrived at Santo Domingo, the colonists greeted him not with celebration but with outright rebellion. In his absence, the colonies of New Spain were fatigued, hungry, and had amassed an incredible debt that the meager amount of gold they were able to scrape from the island's mines had no chance of covering. A myriad of complaints of mismanagement had been issued to the Spanish crown. In response, the crown appointed Francisco de Bobadilla to replace Columbus as governor. The situation was an unmitigated fiasco for Columbus, who found himself having to sign away his title and lands and all else that came with his governorship. After having his position stripped from him, Bobadilla promptly imprisoned Columbus and then sent him back to Spain in shackles. Columbus returned to Spain in 1500 AD, where he was graciously thrown into a Spanish prison. To add insult to injury, news reached him that Portuguese sailor Vasco da Gama had successfully contacted India from South Africa. It was he, and not Columbus, that basked in the glory of establishing the first maritime path to the Orient. The Spanish population, and the rest of Europe for that matter, was stunned that the man who had achieved so much for the crown, who was perceived by so many as a hero of the modern age, was now rotting in a dungeon. And eventually, the public backlash forced the crown to release the Genoese sailor, after only a few weeks in prison. To the surprise of no one, Columbus asked permission for a fourth voyage, and Queen Isabella obliged. But his reputation had been tarnished, and he would not be granted any titles. He was also forbidden to land on Hispaniola. The man who found the New World would be returning as nothing more than an explorer. With 4 ships at his disposal, he embarked from Cadiz on May 11, 1502, to journey to the New World for the last time. The mission for him was personal. He was hoping to find the Straits of Malacca, which makes up the narrow gap between Malaysia and Singapore. But at this time, European scholars were beginning to doubt that East Asia was in fact connected to the New World. Columbus arrived in Puerto Rico in 20 days, breaking his own record by a considerable amount. Despite the Queen's orders, he sought refuge in Hispaniola. At this time, the man governing Hispaniola was Nicolas de Ovando, who replaced Bobadilla. But similar to Bobadilla, Ovando felt no love for Columbus. When signs that a hurricane was approaching caught Columbus's attention, he warned Ovando to keep a massive fleet of 28 ships that were full of gold and bound for Spain to remain docked in port. Ovando ignored the warning. He mocked Columbus as a madman, and he sent the fleet to Spain anyway. Of the 28 ships, only 3 survived, and a tremendous amount of gold was lost to the sea. In the aftermath of the hurricane, and the many more that followed, Columbus sojourned to the Central American coast looking for a pass through the isthmus. Some of the natives he ran across informed him that vast empires could be found to the north, but Columbus was much more intrigued that another ocean could be found further south. He spent the next few months sailing along Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, but he failed to find a wedge that would take him to the promised ocean. He had to end his campaign in early 1503 because his ships had termites and switched course, and sailed for Santo Domingo. But the poor state of his ships was more severe than he realized, and they were barely able to carry him and his crew to Jamaica, and they were marooned in Jamaica for an entire year. Discouraged and in ill health, Columbus departed for Spain in the fall of 1504, never to return again. The cost of his endeavors took a heavy toll on his physical well-being, and Christopher Columbus passed away on May 20th, 1506. His body was placed in a monastery in Seville. Shortly afterward, his body was sent to Santo Domingo, where it remained for over 200 years before it was exhumed and sent to Cuba after Hispaniola was seized by the French in 1795. But when Cuba gained its independence from Spain in 1898, his body was once again unearthed and brought back to Spain in the Cathedral of Seville, where it remains today, for the time being. But Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian explorer, published a book of his maritime adventures in 1507, and it was mostly filled with expeditions that he made up. But he correctly asserted that the New World was in fact a continent, and that the Orient was probably thousands of miles further west. Both continents would eventually be named after him. Before we conclude, I want to talk about Christopher Columbus for a moment. In the early 21st century, there's been a growing tendency to disgrace and castigate iconic figures in history. I'm sure most people viewing this video are aware of attempts to defile and tear down statues of Confederate generals, and even some of the Founding Fathers. There is an ongoing conversation to remove Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill, and it is almost impossible to discuss people like George Washington, Winston Churchill, Thomas Jefferson, and Christopher Columbus without feeling obliged to point out that they were flawed human beings, especially in light of today's cultural and political milieu. History is replete with people conquering another people and obliterating their history. along with their books, their statues, and their texts. And some people even do it to themselves. The French Revolution, for example, attempted to rewrite time and install a new calendar beginning at the year zero. And a staple of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution was the destruction of thousands of historical sites, monuments, and museums. Attempting to circumvent history with little or no knowledge of history is profoundly disturbing and a sure symptom of a greater, mounting disturbance in the social fabric of society. Let's look at it this way. In George Orwell's 1984, one of the key features of the dystopia is that the citizens under Ingsoc, the communist government in charge, and yes, it is communist, Orwell himself said so, they have been so thoroughly infiltrated by the indoctrination of Ingsoc that the people have no memory of any history before the government's rise to power. The adults who lived before Ingsoc have only a vague, fragmented memory of that life. They don't remember their childhood, they don't remember their parents, they don't remember what the country they reside in was even called before Ingsoc. That sounds rather terrible. 1984 is a dystopian novel for a reason. But how does that tie into Columbus and our current society? Well, it can be explained like this. There are some in the Western Hemisphere who have begun the process of stripping our history from underneath us. We have deemed anyone who ever participated in anything to which we disapprove, while completely ignoring historical context, as something that is perfectly reasonable. I find this approach to history to be intellectually dishonest, parochial, and, quite honestly, dangerous. The tale of human experience is one of struggle, contention, war, and the pursuit of meaning. In the West, that struggle has resulted in the greatest civilization and quality of life that anyone has ever known. If a human were to be plucked from any timeline and from any nation and placed in the United States today, they would genuinely believe that they were living in heaven. But to dismantle the services and sacrifices laid down by our ancestors, who gave this to us because we find some of the things they did to be reprehensible, is reprehensible. It is of course fine to point out that, for example, owning slaves was bad. I do believe that accountability is important. But to presume that 160 years after 600,000 young boys tortured and killed each other to further the mantle of freedom justifies your assertion that you are somehow better than they were is, to be frank, asinine and quite arrogant. You live off the seeds of those men, and you probably have never been in a situation where your morals were ever seriously challenged. Probably. But back to Columbus. Columbus has been getting a bad rap as of late, but the accusations filed against him range anywhere from true to outright false, with sort of true sprinkled in the middle. I will cover these points of contention and then throw down my personal opinion over why I believe that we should actually have a Columbus Day restored. Please hear me out. The contention surrounding Columbus mostly has to deal with his treatment of the Taino tribe who dwelled in the Caribbean archipelagos. Here's what actually happened, in chronological order. As I mentioned earlier, during his first voyage, Columbus did order his men to treat the Taino with respect. He also wrote in his journals, though, that he would make them servants of the crown and that he would oversee their conversion to Christianity. And over the course of the next decade, the coercion of the Taino tribe to Spanish rule did take effect, not only by Columbus but by other Spanish officials as well. But it's important to point out that Columbus was a very pious man serving a country that was, at this time, engulfed in a wave of devout Catholicism. Columbus viewed this expedition as a glorious undertaking to spread God's influence and to provide his leaders with a generous bounty. He saw the conversion of the Taino to Catholicism as his holy duty, and therefore he had no incentive to abuse, harm, or murder them. Enforcing their serfdom is of course a blatant human rights violation, especially by today's standards. But look at it this way. Columbus could have very easily killed the entire Taino tribe, and all in one day if he wanted to, for the sake of convenience. There were no laws regarding human rights. Human rights wasn't even a concept in 1492. And if he had wiped them out from existence on that day, very few from the civilized world would have batted an eye or raised a finger, except perhaps for some of the religious community. And believe me, many of the conquistadors who followed Columbus would have absolutely done that without losing a second of sleep. But Columbus did take measures to ensure the Taino were treated well. His journals are replete with Columbus's unabashed affection for the natives, which very few Europeans shared. Therefore, one could actually articulate that his relations with the natives was progressive for the time. When Columbus returned to the La Navidad settlement during his second voyage, he discovered that the men he left behind had been murdered by the Taino, if you recall. Columbus prevented the Spanish council from slaughtering each and every one of the Taino in response, which they very much desired. That is an extraordinary diplomatic feat, and if Columbus had been replaced by almost anyone else in that moment, those indigenous peoples would have met a gruesome and horrific fate. But it's Columbus's governance over Hispaniola where the situation becomes more dicey. His short tenure as governor was, by all accounts, an unmitigated disaster. This is where his perception as a cruel and barbaric leader takes root. During this 2-year episode, his actions would damage his reputation beyond rectification, and here's why. Columbus was foremost an explorer, and he spent most of his governorship sailing to new places and, well, not governing. This opened up the opportunity of the Spanish to inflict an array of atrocities against the natives, who had at this time been made serfs of the crown. When Columbus was around, he tried to maintain order by imposing harsh punishments that included the lopping off of hands, feet, and noses of those who broke the law. Shockingly, that form of punishment only festered more resentment against his rule and brought about his political demise. What is worth mentioning, though, is that Columbus mostly handed out this punishment against the Spanish for mistreating the natives. It's also important to point out that the natives were not slaves. They were compensated for their forced labor and held peasant status by law. Again, all of this sounds terrible when viewed through a modern-day lens, but in the late 15th century, enforced serfdom would have been customary and expected when running into a new group of people who can't fend for themselves. Columbus lost his governorship during his third voyage, and he was replaced by Francisco de Bobadilla, who reigned for a year and then was himself replaced by Nicolas de Ovando. Ovando had governed Hispaniola for 7 years, and it was under his administration that the native population dropped inestimably. He facilitated numerous massacres bordering on genocide, and he and many of his political constituents would blame the withering native population on Columbus. This is another problem when it comes to determining Columbus's legacy. Many of his political adversaries took great pains to smear Columbus's image, and it's mostly the writings of these people that have permeated the history books and documentations of Columbus that we are taught today. And if that wasn't enough, English scholars would standardize a smear campaign against all Spanish explorers in the centuries that followed to glorify their own explorers. The propagandistic slandering of historical persons and nations is referred to as Black Legend. There are actually many great videos on YouTube that discuss Black Legend and how Columbus had fallen prey to it, and I highly recommend checking those out. In summary, Columbus was a flawed human being, but his determination to navigate the unknown undeniably marks him as a brave and courageous man. His expedition connected a new world to the old one, and we today reap the benefits of his bold undertaking. The death and destruction of the natives is very tragic, but was unfortunately bound to happen because someone else would have eventually found the new world, and the indigenous tribes were simply too technologically backwards to prevent their demise. But the greatest purveyor of death against the natives was not people but disease. Disease wiped out 90 to 95% of the entire native population in the Americas between the time of Columbus's first voyage and the settlement of Jamestown in 1607. And again, the rampant disease that plagued the Americas was inevitable, as there were no domesticated farm animals in the Americas, and someone from the established world would have found the Americas and unknowingly spread the various flus and poxes that result in being in close approximation with those animals. It seems many people also hold Columbus accountable for every crime ever committed by a European against a native, regardless of how far into the future the said crime may have taken place. This is dumb, obviously, because people cannot be held accountable for crimes that occurred after their death. He also probably would have opposed most of those crimes since in his own life he took great strides to maintain peaceful relations with the natives. And lastly, Columbus has been accused of genocide. Columbus is not guilty of genocide. He condemned massacres against the natives when they surfaced. Remember, he believed that their conversion to Christianity was paramount, and he very much wanted them alive so that they could serve God. There is no evidence that he ever advocated for the mass murder of any of the indigenous tribes during his life. Also, the American natives were not entirely innocent either. This is something that has baffled me, the idea that some people are inherently virtuous and some are not. All human beings are a mix of good and evil, and that includes the Native Americans. Some tribes were peaceful, like the Taino, but many tribes were violent and brutal. The Iroquois, for example, had a long-standing policy that if they warred with another tribe after a certain amount of time, they would defeat that tribe and then they would murder every man, woman, and child, effectively eradicating that tribe from existence so that they would avoid ever having to go to war with them again. There are many North American tribes we don't know about today because the Iroquois instituted this genocidal policy, and they were not alone. Many tribes employed this practice of tribal eradication. Many tribes were also cannibalistic. If you recall my second video in the series, The Aztecs sacrificed 20,000 men, women, and children a year as part of their religious ceremonies. Now, having an Indigenous Peoples Day is fine, but it should not come at the expense of Columbus Day. I am a firm advocate in having a Columbus Day to celebrate the guile and will of a man who boldly and bravely went where no one had gone before. In my opinion, very few people throughout history actually measure up to him. It's time for us to stop revisioning and self-correcting our history. It's time for us to start digging a little deeper and at least doing the courtesy of researching the controversial people and topics of history before casting judgment. You are welcome to disagree with me, but if you are going to put forth an argument, all I ask is that you please come after me with some knowledge and literacy of the topic first. After all, historical context does matter. Well, that's all for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. I hope that at the very least I provided a new perspective of Columbus for you, and if you strongly disagree with my take, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. In my next video, we'll explore the conquistadors who brought down the great empires in South and Central America. I'll see you all next time.